for now, we're going to turn it over to Poti's very interesting MMT workshop, Modern Monetary Theory. Poti, do you want to take it away?
Sure. Thank you so much, Selma, and thank you to the previous speakers for setting us up to connect what we just heard with our opening panel. I'm pleased today to be introducing my fellow panelists. Those are Lacey Watson and Fadl Kaboub. Lacey Watson has scored a historic primary win in our neighboring state of West Virginia. If Lacey, an MMT candidate from the start, scores a win in November, he will be the first African American representing the state of West Virginia in the 3rd district, but for the entire state. Fadl Kaboub, who is a professor at Denison University, is a leading expert on MMT, and as the president of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity, is about as close, I think, as we can get to the heart of the Green New Deal as carried forward by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the Bernie 2020 platform. I am Panayotis Yannakouros, a research scholar at the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity, and will introduce our panel with an overview of MMT based on my interactive workshops. So Ronald Reagan's counterpart, Margaret Thatcher, said, "The problem with socialism is that eventually you run out of other people's money." We can't really be progressives if we take this bait. If we do, our bold progressive programs fail. When they fail, we can blame the Republicans for not cutting the defense budget or not raising taxes to pay for it, and they'll gladly take the blame and keep winning elections while we die of despair. Today, I'll tell you how to pay for it and why that's the wrong question. Imagine, for clarifying some concepts, that we are in a magical realm with a drawbridge outside your door, so you cannot leave your home unless you get one of these flyers that I have handy here. In my workshops, people gladly hand over imaginary food and services for them. They are valuable, and I have unlimited ability to issue them. But my power isn't unlimited. If I run out of things to buy, I can keep issuing more permissions, but I'll not get any more things. I'll just see prices starting to run up, known as inflation. Imagine now that you can go freely, you can come and go freely, but your grocer or your doctor all have these debts. Most people will still work to get one of these pieces of paper, and once they have it, which we call a negotiable instrument, they'll give it to someone who needs it in exchange for something they need. And when they do that, the world turns upside down, because in that step, they monetized their society when that negotiable instrument changes hands and transfers economic goods. This is so important that I printed up on a cheat sheet for them to remember what they've done. So here's the cheat sheet. It has the face of the sovereign on it. And next to his face, we have 2 lines that will transport the person back to what they just experienced. And if you know what is on one of those bills, you know that it says this note is legal tender for all debts public. But note what we just did here. That line, which reminds us of the exercise we just did here, making a piece of paper valuable just by virtue of the power of the ruler, is written on the national currency of the United States. So this is the setting up of the undoing of Margaret Thatcher, because anything we derive from this also applies to our currency. One thing that follows directly from this is that we cannot run out of money. Now, imagine that you have earned a stash of these permissions, and that I take just one away from you in taxes so that you can go free, and you walk out across the drawbridge with some extra in your pocket. Think about how you're feeling about that extra in your pocket. So I'm going to give us 3 definitions, and the first definition is going to be that thing that you're probably feeling good about in your pocket. That is the federal budget deficit. Now, you might decide that you want to keep that stash of material safe. You could put it in a special savings account that your bank has access to at the Federal Reserve. We call that a treasury security. And the piled up stockpile of these permissions in safekeeping that have not yet been used to pay taxes is definition number 2, the national debt. Even less scary than the deficit, because the deficit we could have run up accumulating, hitting our boundaries and getting inflation. We could have spent it inequitably and disturbing peace in our society, but once it's spent, it's water under the bridge. Not scary at all. The third definition that I'll give you is a negative number. Imagine now that you don't have anything and it's a new fiscal year and I impose liabilities on all of you, so you have to scramble to get these permissions, and Tommy LeBeau gets it. And he turns in his taxes and goes out for a walk. Now you still owe. Are you willing to work, go to the grocer, and not to buy fruit, but to offer your labor? And the grocer doesn't have any permissions either. The state you're in now is definition number 3, unemployment. And putting it this way, you can see that unemployment is not your fault. As Brianna Joy Gray said in a nice little clip, it is a policy choice by the currency issuer. For some perspective then on the rhetoric of debt, taxpayers, and labor, I'll do a little bit of history. Another thing that you should have noticed here is, as we were doing this rather rapidly, I was spending as the sovereign, and then as you were getting ready to leave, I was taking back taxes. Now, if we looked at how our payment system worked, what we would see is that these tax receipts cancel out against your tax liability. If we did it on a spreadsheet, it would be like a +5 if you paid $5 in taxes and a -5 in your liability. Put them together, they cancel, turn into a 0. Can your taxpayer dollar pay for anything? If you just saw it vanish into a 0, clearly it can't. So several things that we have strong intuitions about, if we just follow some simple logic, appear not to be well-founded. So where do we get that emotional loading? For that, I'll try to share my screen and do a little bit of Virginia history for you. Okay, so here we see the quote from Margaret Thatcher. And here we see some terrible things that happened on this soil. Some people who had violent control of this soil had the idea that they could circulate as currency as well, and they were more direct on their bills. They said receivable in payment of taxes. Fortunately, we defeated them, and as they were losing their power, they were not very happy about the change in conditions. Now, they had accumulated here in Virginia quite a big currency user debt, which is different from our national debt, because they had tried to build new infrastructure because they had exhausted their soil through something terrible that they had done, which was using enslaved labor to grow crops. And once the people who had been enslaved won their freedom in that war, the planters insisted that unless they resorted to the overseer, the whip, and the hounds, their estates would deteriorate and never recover. Planters resented that emancipation not only challenged their sense of racial supremacy, but also eroded their authority as employers of labor. So why are we so cruel to our labor? There are some deep roots here. And what about their attitudes toward debt and this notion of the taxpayer? Well, here in Virginia, we had both a fiscal crisis from the point of view of the currency using state that we heard about from the medical doctors, for example, and there was a nationwide depression going on. And the conservatives were still in charge. And what they did in this debt crisis, they cut the schools that had been newly established. Well, what happened when they cut the schools is that the people who had been newly enfranchised got together, and with their votes, they took the state. Now, the planter class was not ready for this. They did not believe that this could ever be possible. And this is how they were feeling in the midst of what we call the Readjuster Coalition's rule. They threw up their hands and said at that point, it is not about the debt. It is not the debt question, but a struggle between conservative Democrats on one side for supremacy, note the word, of a good and safe government, and the worst political combination ever brought into coalition in Virginia on the other. What are they talking about here? Well, we're doing etymology here. They said, our hard-working, industrious, thriving people. Where have we heard that dog whistle? Well, they didn't dog whistle back here. They're going to make it explicit. Will never consent to allow the worthless class to determine what amount of taxes they shall pay. So you start to see the taxpayer meme emerging. Taking it another step forward, we shall not see our state placed in the hands of non-property holders, non-tax-paying people. And what sort of people are they talking about? I told you they're not going to mince words. It is a fight between the Anglo-Saxon and the African. So next time you think about using the term taxpayer dollar, think about this etymology. Think about that it doesn't make sense to begin with. And think about that the emotional loading goes back to something very ugly in our history. And I would offer you an alternative word, public money, public dollars. And that's where the real action is. The real action is when we get to the federal level, and I will quickly wrap it up, because the way we pay for things at the federal level is not by recirculating the sovereign's currency. We issue permissions here in the United States according to the Constitution, which puts that power in the hands of Congress, specifically the House of Representatives. And what that is that we, with our little hands, send forward a representative, and then those representatives sit together in Congress, and they are presented engineering specifications of things we'd like to do and how it's done. Now, if they vote to pass that bill, at the bottom of the bill is a number that says how much it will cost. And the way they pay for it is they communicate the number to the Treasury, which communicates it to the Federal Reserve, which credits the appropriate accounts. That's all there is. That's boring. The interesting part is, what are we going to do? Now, how about Margaret Thatcher? So why is Margaret Thatcher lying to us and slapping our hand and telling us, no, don't do this? Because you look at what this implies. This implies that we, with our little hands, could have had our representative with their hand write a number arbitrarily large as needed, as Vice President Biden said, to shape our society as we would like with our hands. Now, when they slap our hand and lie to us and tell us you can't do that, who does that leave to shape our society? It leaves unaccountable people who get a say in proportion to the size of the stack of permissions that they have extracted from the rest of us in shares greater than their share. And there you have some of that agenda. Now, with that, pointing to some of the immense power that our vote has that we haven't thought about, I will hand it over to Lacey Watson and let him tell us a little bit about what it's like to be voted into office and more. Lacey?
Can everybody hear me? Perfect. So my name is Lacey Watson, and I am running to be the first African-American congressional candidate from the state of West Virginia, located in the 3rd District. So if you are familiar with West Virginia, the 3rd District would be the lower 18 counties at the bottom of the state, starting with Mason and Cabell County on our far left, looking at the map, and ending with Pocahontas and Greenbrier County on our far right. A little bit of demographics about my district. I am 93% white with a median income of about $34,000 to $44,000 per year. We have a high school graduation rate of 80% and a college graduation rate of about 20%. So that can give you a snippet of the demographic of my constituents and how important messaging was in relaying this idea of modern monetary theory as espouse the benefits of living in a democratic society. So what I did throughout my whole campaign effort was to make modern monetary theory simple enough for everyone to grasp it in a short amount of time. And from, you know, the results that I've had in my primary election, I was very successful in doing so. Poti gave you a more detailed understanding of modern monetary theory, but what I did in my messaging was relate that theory directly to opportunities and how we could leverage West Virginia's 3rd district to accept these policies and to move forward in a way that would allow the working class people of West Virginia some loosening of the, I think a perfect analogy would be the knee on the person's neck financially. So in my messaging, I started out with the basic definition of modern monetary theory as Poti detailed quite nicely. And from there, I worked that into a narrative I constructed concerning jobs. Issue for Southern West Virginia would be the issue of jobs and how do we create more jobs and how do we sustain the individuals that are living in our district in a meaningful way without incurring more debt on them. And I would say, yeah, just, you know, without incurring more debt on themselves. And what we found was that the individuals within the 3rd district, they are very open to the ideas and concepts of modern monetary theory and how that could be a positive impact. It's a second narrative to the narrative they have been given throughout their life, and it worked wonders. I would also say that what West Virginia needs now, as far as an understanding of economics, is a newer narrative, and modern monetary theory does that. And people, you know, with this demographic that I have, are resonating with this message. And I think on a smaller level, given the parameters of the person delivering the message and the receptiveness of the audience, it is a viable option for West Virginians. And, you know, I will keep on delivering this message as I go through the general election in order to really solidify modern monetary's place in our history as a state and, you know, the overall running of the nation. I think that concludes most of my time right now. I would love to take any questions that you guys have, particularly about West Virginia and the messaging that I used to win over my population of people at the very end. But thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. And I think I'm up next, and I'd like to be able to share my slides. I have a few slides, and then I'll try to save as much time for us to have a Q&A session and a conversation. So I'll go ahead and start sharing my screen, and hopefully this will appear smoothly. Maybe Poti, if somebody can confirm that you can see my slides.
Yes, we can. It's working fine.
Okay, wonderful. I'll try to make this full screen if Zoom lets me do it. Let's see. Okay, it's going to take a minute to load on my side. There you go. So the big question that everybody gets, you know, Democrats, Republican, anybody with a public policy platform, to, spend on healthcare, education, reparations, Green New Deal. The question is, how do you pay for it? And what I'd like to suggest today is that when we think about the US federal government, that is not even the right question, right? So let's dive into it based on what my two colleagues have proposed. First, I'd like to suggest that we don't shy away from being radicals. And I really insist on using the term radical and retaking the meaning of the term. We have deep structural problems, a climate crisis, inequality crisis, socioeconomic exclusion crisis, a dysfunctional political system, and the establishment is looking for incremental bipartisan solutions. In other words, we're looking for superficial status quo solutions. So why I use the term radical? I use it in the linguistic sense of the term. Radical means going to the roots of the problem. In other words, addressing the structural and the systemic change that needs to take place. The opposite of radical change is superficial change. So we really have to decide, do we want systemic structural change or superficial change? We can't afford the superficial change. I'm reminded of the words of Martin Luther King here, where he says, this is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. This is exactly what I'm talking about, the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. We need radical systemic change, not superficial, bipartisan change. The political establishment of our dysfunctional political system today is trying to convince us that we need incremental bipartisan solutions. That is the textbook definition of the status quo. And I think we all agree today that we're not looking for more of the same, more of the status quo. The Green New Deal in particular, to me, is about two major things. One is the inequality and socioeconomic exclusion crisis. The other one is the climate crisis, and they're interlinked. And I'm not going to show you a lot of data here, but I really wanted to show you this particular picture here because it's so important to what we're going through in this country. So to simplify the meaning of this picture, which is by my colleague Pavlina Cherneva, another MMT economist, what you're looking at here, the blue bars represent the bottom 90% of the population, and the red bars represent the top 10%, right? We don't have to go to the top 1%, just the top 10%. And what this picture is trying to show is essentially every time we go through a recession and we recover, this graph is showing us how much of that recovery, the wealth generated by the recovery, is going to the bottom 90% versus the top 10%. And it used to be the case a long time ago that after every recession, when we recover, most of the gains from the recovery go to the bottom 90%, which is the way it's supposed to be. And the top 10% get some of the gains, right? But then starting in the 60s and the 70s and accelerating in the 80s, most of the gains from the recovery started to go to the top 10%. And look what happened in the last recovery. Recovery, not the recession. This is the recovery when the recession is over. The top 10% gained more than 100% of the gains from the recovery. And the bottom 90% lost ground.
Dr. Kaboub, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but on our screens, it looks like you're stuck at the first slide and we haven't seen the last 3 slides. We can see them in little on your left-hand column, but people can't see the, can't see the slides. Okay, there we go. Thank you so much. Is this better? Yes.
Okay. Sorry about that. So I'll just leave it like this instead of doing full screen. So since you didn't see it, I really want to give you a chance to look at what I'm talking about. So after every recovery, who gains from the recovery? It used to be the case, the bottom 90% gets most of the gains from the recovery, and the top 10% gets a little bit. And now we're looking at most of the gains from the recovery going to the top 10%. This last recovery between 2009 and 2012, the bottom 90% lost ground. And this is why most of you probably interact with people. Maybe you've experienced this yourself in 2012, 13, 14, 15. Most people around me were saying, well, it feels like it's still a recession. And it's because of this, because there was no recovery for the majority of the people, right? So we haven't done anything structural to undo this problem, which means as we recover, hopefully, from this crisis, I suspect that we're going to see this and maybe even worse. in the coming years. So the Green New Deal is designed to undo some of these structural inequities that are built in the system by design. They're not going to go away just by, hoping for a better world. You have to actually actively implement policies. And now the question becomes, how do we pay for it, right? So a quick thing about the Green New Deal and how it addresses these things. Number one, it's federally funded. You can't have a Green New Deal funded at the local level, because local, state, and state authorities and city authorities are limited in their spending capacity by the tax revenues that they get and by whatever the market allows them to borrow. So yes, they can get things done, but it's very, very limited. It doesn't mean you can't improve on energy efficiency. It doesn't mean you can't spend in the right way, to spend in the most neglected areas of the economy, the most neglected communities. Of course, you can do that at the city level, at the state level, but we're talking about the firepower of transforming an economy structurally. States and municipalities are not going to be able to do more than a little bit of, helpful patchwork. But the federal government at this point in time is the only entity that can do this structural transformative way. That doesn't mean the federal government decides everything. Federally funded, locally implemented in a decentralized way. This is really about reviving democracy, participatory budgeting, participatory selection of projects, participatory auditing, and everything that is about deciding what to do gets done at the local level. Everything that is about funding has to come from the federal government. It has to be urban and rural, right? And let's not forget about rural areas in the United States. It has to be inclusive, it has to be just, it has to be restorative. Inclusive in the sense that, you notice the name Green New Deal is a reference to the original New Deal, which was not inclusive. So let's not repeat the mistakes of the 1920s and the 1930s, and let's restore and introduce, a system that is, that is fair and equitable, and that allows for shares prosperity. And it has to be just in the sense of a just transition. In other words, yes, we want to decarbonize the economy, but we don't want to end people's livelihood, right? So if we transition away from coal mining, we have to have a job guarantee that transitions workers to guaranteed jobs with decent wages and benefits, not decarbonizing the economy and forcing people to go look for jobs and look for training, pay for it out of pocket. So just transition is very important to the concept of the Green New Deal, and it has to be comprehensive and permanent. So we can't just do this for a few years and then hope that we've ended climate change or we've ended inequality. It has to be comprehensive in the sense that it's not just about solar panels and wind turbines. It has to be, transformative to the entire productive system, the way we consume and deliver and produce. We're talking about R&D in material science to make sure that everything we produce and consume and transport is done in a sustainable way, so that we produce a fully and truly circular economy moving forward. To me, the framework, the main framework for the Green New Deal is that we take people, and the job guarantee, to be honest, which is a core component of the Green New Deal, we take people as they are, where they are, and we do on-the-job paid training with living wages and benefits. And we have to be, willing and able to offer a broader support network that includes housing, mental health care, legal aid, soft skills, family counseling, career counseling, to allow people to thrive on the job and to reconnect with the local community on a stronger foundation. To be honest, we can't just set people up for failure and say, we're going to offer you a job and it's going to pay $15 an hour and you got to show up at 8 o'clock. But what if I have mental health issues? What if I have family issues? What if I don't have any experience on the job? Then you're setting me up for failure. So when we say benefits, those benefits need to be inclusive of services that truly allow communities to thrive, and to build on a stronger foundation. In other words, we don't give up on people. In other words, we lift everybody up to higher grounds systematically, not hoping that things will happen. So the question is, how are we going to pay for this very ambitious program? We're told that the government is broke, we're running out of dollars, the rich will never pay taxes, the debt will burden future generations, and then you hear people talking about Zimbabwe and hyperinflation and Weimar Republic, and we're going to have to borrow more money from China. And what I'd like to invite you to do is, with this webinar today is to learn how to call their bluff when they say we can't afford this stuff. So my suggestion is to think about how we paid for World War II. World War II came after the Great Depression, the most miserable time in the history of the United States. There was no money to be taxed during the Great Depression. There was no money to be borrowed. And then we had to face this massive spending effort for the war after Pearl Harbor. And we didn't tax anybody before the war. We didn't borrow from anybody before the war. But we entered the war and we were able to spend massive amounts of money without bankrupting the country, without causing inflation or hyperinflation, and without having to borrow from China or Germany or any other country. Forget about World War II. How did we pay for the CARES Act? Right? 3 weeks before the CARES Act, every single person in Washington, D.C., you ask them, they say, we can't afford the Green New Deal. We can't afford Medicare for all. We have no money. And then all of a sudden, the pandemic hits, and they passed the CARES Act with $2+ trillion that were spent into existence out of thin air. Nobody said, where did that money come from? Nobody said, who did we tax? Who did we borrow from? Because the power of the purse is in the hands of Congress. They spend money into existence on all kinds of priorities. The priority 2 months ago, 3 months ago was to deal with the pandemic. The priority before that was funding the military. The priority before that was tax cuts for the rich. The priority before that was to invade Iraq. There's always a priority, and Congress is always able to meet it. Now it's time for us to send people to Congress, 535 representatives who know what the priorities of the people are, and to vote accordingly and spend accordingly. So we're talking about a paradigm shift here. So Congress has the power of the purse. Number one, Congress decides on the budget and how much to spend. So government budget is not the same thing as my budget or your budget. It's not a household budget. Government spending is not constrained by tax revenues, like at the city or state level, right? Cities need tax revenues, but the federal government doesn't need tax revenues in order to spend. Government spending is constrained by other things. Those things are mainly the risk of inflation. So the question becomes that spending capacity, or what we call the spending space that the government has, the fiscal policy space, is much, much larger than the tax revenue space that we usually think of. So what the limit is not tax revenues, the limit is the inflation risk, which is a much larger space. Inflation is determined by a couple of things. One is a productive capacity of the economy. In other words, do we have enough machines and tools and raw materials and skilled people to get things done? If we do, there will be no inflation. If we don't, then we're running out of materials. So the good thing about shortage of productive capacity is that it's producible. We get to produce more, we get to hire more people, we get to create millions of jobs. So that's doable, right? The other constraint is much more complicated, political in this sense. So the second thing that causes inflation is market power, where you have key players in the economy, like Big Pharma, like Wall Street, like big real estate developers, who can raise prices because they can, because they have too much market power, because Congress allows them to do so. Remember, the lawmakers, their job is to regulate the market. But in many cases, think of Big Pharma, think of insurance companies and so on. This is where inflation comes in. And that type of inflation, you're not going to be able to get rid of it by spending more or spending less. You get rid of it by taxing and regulating their market power out of existence. In other words, you make that market more democratic, you make it more competitive. And that's the job of lawmakers. And if lawmakers abdicate that authority and let the market rule, then we, the people, suffer the consequences in terms of inflation and suffer the consequences in terms of, Congress telling us, well, we can't afford more of that because those companies are sucking profits to the top 1%. And if we give them more spending, they'll suck more of it. which is precisely what happens, right? So the goals, once we understand this concept, number one, we decouple the concept of spending from taxing at the federal level, not at the city or state level. Cities need taxes, states need taxes, but Congress at the federal level, spending and taxing are two important functions, but they're not connected. It's not one that pays for the other. So we spend on national priorities, healthcare, education, infrastructure, the Green New Deal, whatever we as a democratic society decide are the priorities. We spend on improving productive capacity, on strategic areas of the economy. But then when it comes to taxing, we're not going to tax oil companies or fossil fuel companies because we need their money or their permission to fund the Green New Deal. We're going to tax them because we want to decarbonize the economy, right? We're not going to tax the ultra rich because we need their money or their permission to fund healthcare. We're going to tax them because we want to reduce inequality, because we want to protect democracy from oligarchy, because we want to reduce their power and influence in politics, their power and influence in the market system. Those are very important functions. It has nothing to do with funding healthcare or funding education. So by addressing those via taxation and regulation, we free up the spending capacity of the federal government to address the national priorities. Taxing Wall Street, again, not because we need their money to pay for education, but because we want to reduce speculation. We want to reduce their power and influence in politics, their power and influence in the economy, to reduce inequality, to reduce abusive market power. These are very important goals. And once you think of taxes and spending in this decoupled way, then you realize that we're not really thinking about redistribution, where money goes to the top and then we take it and redistribute it. We're talking about pre-distribution, where money is distributed the right way from the beginning, right? And this way, we don't have to think of redistribution and begging the rich to pay taxes. Many of my really progressive friends and colleagues are stuck in this vicious cycle that says tax this to pay for that. And I would like to invite you to think of this as a very dangerous and counterproductive strategy. Here's why. Because if we believe that our Green New Deal and our equitable society depends on tax revenues from the rich and from fossil fuel companies, from Wall Street companies, then as a matter of logic, then we want those companies to be even wealthier and richer and have even more income so we can tax a little bit away from them to get our little priorities. That's the wrong thing to do. We want to undo that power, not give them more power and more control over the national priorities. So let's think of decoupling these two things. Can we afford this, right? Everybody says, can we afford all of this? This is the wrong question. Can we afford these pictures? Can we afford what's happening to these children? Can we afford the fracking and the public health crisis that we're dealing with? Can we afford this? These are the questions. Can we afford the forest fires? Can we afford the floods in the Midwest? The problem is the narrative that dominates the public policy discourse when it comes to economic decisions is always focused on economic growth. And they back us against the corner and they say, well, if you want schools, if you want funding for your programs, the fracking companies are creating jobs, they're creating wealth, they're creating economic growth. And we measure economic growth with, I'm going to move this for a second. We measure economic growth by GDP, gross domestic product. That's what we call economic growth. The problem is this economic growth includes all kinds of things that reduce our quality of life. For example, every time we build a prison, GDP goes up. Every time somebody gets sick and goes to the hospital for a breathing treatment or for cancer treatment or pays for a prescription for something related to pollution, GDP goes up and gets celebrated on TV. They say, yay, GDP goes up by 2%. It gets celebrated. The fact that there's an oil spill and we spend $200 million to clean it up, GDP goes up by $200 million, but that doesn't mean that's a good thing for society. So what some economists did is they took this GDP number and they stripped it of all of those negative things that actually reduce our quality of life. And then we get this, the genuine progress indicator. You see this line? This goes back to the 1950s. For at least the last 40 years, we have no improvement in quality of life in this country. No improvement. And this is why this narrative makes sense to the average person who's, these are the constituents you're trying to vote for your candidates, right? This is their lived experience. Their lived experience, they're not getting ahead. They just don't know why, because the narrative in the media, on TV, and every other politician is saying, we need more economic growth. And they say, fine, we'll support you for more economic growth. But what am I getting out of it? Nothing, right? So we need to change the narrative. And once we change the metric and say, what are the things that actually improve my quality of life? The list of investments will pop up immediately. And the Green New Deal becomes so obvious. So then the average person really understands that when you say, would you rather spend, a little bit of money for after school programs to inspire kids with music and theater and summer camps and science, or not do that because we think it's too expensive, we can't afford it. And then 10, 15 years later, deal with, a public health crisis, with the opioid crisis, or building more prisons. Would you rather spend money up front for clean energy to clean up the water source, or not do that because it's too expensive, and then 10 years later, pay for cancer treatment for everybody in town? So what I'm suggesting here is that the status quo is too expensive. The status quo is unaffordable. What we're proposing, the Green New Deal, Medicare for all of these things are much, much cheaper and much more humane for obvious reasons than the status quo that we think is affordable, right? So it's about changing the narrative politically and in the economics profession to set the priorities straight. And I'll close with this. We have 10 years to go, 10 years to act. There is really no time for small incremental solutions. The climate crisis, the inequality crisis, poverty, exclusion, injustice, all of these things call for bold, radical, transformative actions. The current climate policies, the jobs policies are too weak, too slow, too expensive, and they don't even work. Economic justice and climate justice via a living wage Green New Deal are possible, desirable, and affordable. And with that, I'm happy to take questions and engage in conversation. And I know our time is short today, but please feel free to get my contact information from here. Feel free to engage with us and with other candidates who are running on an MMT platform, a Green New Deal platform, and with the MMT scholars and the social media platforms that you're connected to. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fadel. And we will be going all day, and we've got an after party today. If you want to stay, if you want to pop back, you're absolutely welcome. And by all means, do keep in touch. There was one very simple question at the end. They asked, what do you mean, how do we pay for it, isn't the right question. So both of us have kind of answered that. Do you want to take a stab at it?
Sure. So the way Congress pays for things at the national government is simply by, getting 535 people in Washington, D.C. They decide this issue is a priority, let's say invading a country, let's say a tax cut, let's say a Green New Deal. They vote, and as they vote on that bill, they include the budget that says, we authorize the U.S., Treasury to pay for this program. The contractors who get, their checks from the Treasury for building infrastructure, for teaching, for, doing whatever things the government decided to do. They take their check to their bank, they deposit it, the bank, takes it through, the back, channels. It ends up at the U.S. Federal Reserve Bank, which is the bank of the federal government. The Federal Reserve Bank will clear that check by crediting the account of the appropriate, company that was, the bank and the company that was, doing the service for the U.S. government, and they will debit the account of the U.S. Treasury. That's as simple as that. We usually think of, spending, as something that, needs to be funded by tax revenues, which is true for you and I. You and I have to work hard and earn an income first. Then we can spend. We can spend a little bit beyond our means by borrowing up to a certain limit, borrowing from a friend, from a bank, or whatever. But that's it. Our spending capacity is limited by how much we earn and how much we can borrow up to a certain limit. States and municipalities too. Municipalities have to collect taxes. States have to collect taxes. They too can borrow up to a certain limit, but not beyond that, not much beyond that. But the federal government spends money into existence. The logic is the exact opposite. The federal government spends money first, then collects it in taxes. So it's not limited by tax revenues, but it's limited by how much actual productive capacity the economy can handle without hitting the inflation limit. So it's a tough pill to swallow. And what I'm explaining here about MMT, about federal government spending, is only for the sovereign. Don't try this at home. This will not work for you, right? This is only the US federal government can do this. States and municipalities, they have to spend responsibly. You and I have to spend responsibly. Otherwise we go bankrupt, right? But the federal government has zero risk of solvency. It can never run out of its own money, but it can run out of things to buy. If we, in the productive capacity of the economy, run out of things to sell, things to produce, run out of engineering capabilities or raw materials, that's when the federal government starts to cause inflation, when there is really not enough stuff to go around for the government to start bidding up prices and so on. So the right question at the federal level is not how to pay for it, but how to mobilize the resources to produce the things that the national government, that the democratic society wants to prioritize. So how to mobilize the resources, how to organize the political system, the economic system, so that we prioritize those things. And in other words, what we're describing here in the MMT framework is really not an MMT idea that needs to be applied by Congress. Congress already does it. They just have the wrong priorities, right? They prioritize tax cuts. They prioritize not regulating big pharma. They prioritize, military spending and other things. And we're saying, a government of the people, by the people, for the people, should elect 535 people in Congress to set the priorities of their constituents, not the super PACs that get them in office, right? Not the lobbying, groups that have other priorities, right? I mean, there wouldn't be lobbying if their priorities and our priorities were the same. There's no need for lobbying, right? But their lobbying is obviously very powerful to set up the system to serve their needs. And the data speaks for itself. This is not something new that happened 2 years ago or 3 years ago or 10 years ago. Money's been sucked to the top systematically for decades. And chipping away at this problem left and right by saying, oh, let's elect this person, he's slightly better than the other person. But if that person doesn't really have a strategy for undoing the damage in a transformative way, then we're really wasting our time.
Great. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but if Tommy is here, Tommy, collect emails. I've just put my email in the chat, and Susan is talking about a session at 6 tomorrow, perhaps come to the workshops later, but we've got to yield. We've got a 2-minute break while the next session sets up. So thank you all very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.